Welcome to Brown Bag History for May 1st, 2024. And as we begin, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is the Sinaiic's homeland and traditional territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land, sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So today, May 1st, is International Workers' Day, and it was declared, I think the first one was held in 1890, and then in 1891, it was declared an annual event by the International Socialist Congress, which was throughout Europe. And so they proclaimed this as a day to acknowledge workers throughout the world, and it still is commemorated as that. So I'll start by talking about the first railway strike that was held in this area. It was 1885 during railway construction, when the company was unable to pay its workers for 3 consecutive months. And said during the strike, there were about 5,000 men working between Eagle Pass and Golden, and they concentrated right around what was then Farwell. So there was big crowds of unemployed men here at some time. There was actually a riot at Beavermouth, and it was the riot was calmed by Colonel Sam Steele, who's the man in the front wearing the white helmet, and he was a commander of the Northwest Mounted Police, who were stationed at Farwell at that time and throughout the railway construction areas. They said that he was suffering from Rocky Mountain spotted fever at the time, but he got off of his deathbed to read the riot act to the rioters at Beavermouth, and they calmed things. But it was definitely, the CPR was in dire straits for a while until they got additional funding from Barings Bank in England, who was headed by Lord Revelstoke, and that's how we ended up with our name. We're named after Lord Revelstoke. But anyway, that was sort of the first known strike in the area. And they were able to complete the construction of the CPR at Craigellachie, November 7th, 1885. Obviously, it was a massive infrastructure project that took several years to complete, involving many, many thousands of workers. And on the west end of the construction, between mostly Yale, Vancouver and Yale, and to Craigellachie, there were several thousand Chinese men who were specifically brought over to work on the railway. And they were paid about half of what the white workers were paid. They were not given proper, they were given tents to sleep in, whereas most of the workers had cabins to stay in. They were, contrary to the promises, the men were laid off in the winters and in some cases actually left to starve. There was one found newspaper accounts from around Hope, where several Chinese men died of scurvy one winter because they couldn't get proper food to eat. So, and of course, and they were often given the most dangerous jobs as well, including going into tunnels with for blasting work. I've heard notes about how many people died during the construction of the railway, but it's hard to pin that down because I haven't been able to find any death certificates of any of the Chinese workers, even though it was a requirement to register deaths at that time. You go into the records and there's no death records of any of the Chinese workers, but you can find records of the white workers who died during the construction. So, I've heard estimates of up to 10,000 people who died during the construction. That could be high, but we don't really know. We just don't know how many died. But anyway, there was also a lot of concern especially in Victoria, about the number of Chinese people who'd been brought over to Canada, and as a result of that, well, there was a lot of people saying that, you know, they shouldn't be working on the railway. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald said, if you don't have the Chinese workers, you won't have the railway. So it can't be done, just because of the amount of work that was involved. And there were big workforces from, you know, Ontario westward, but to do the western end, there weren't that many people living in British Columbia at the time. So really, in order to get the work done on that part of the line, they needed they needed that labor. But as I say, they weren't treated well. They weren't made welcome. There was actually a Royal Commission on Chinese immigration that was brought in effect, or was undertaken in 1885. And as a result of that, the government of Canada implemented the head tax, which was basically making Chinese people coming to Canada have to pay. And they were the only race or ethnicity of people that had to pay to come into Canada. And that was still in effect until the 1920s, when the government then had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was in place until after World War II. But that Exclusion Act actually eliminated the head tax, but it made it really hard for the Chinese workers. They faced a lot of discrimination. But and of course, when you look at the picture of the driving of the last flight, there's no Chinese people in that photograph, or no Indigenous people either. And a lot of Indigenous people also worked on the railway. So they certainly weren't reflected in that famous Canadian photograph. Also wanted to talk a little bit about forced labor, because that happened in a couple of situations in Canada, and specifically in this area. During World War I, there was an internment camp on Mount Revelstoke, and right after World War I broke out, the government of Canada uh, implemented the War Measures Act, and with that, they created an internment program that lasted until 1920. And over that time, there were over 8,500 people interned in camps across Canada, and the majority of them were work camps. There were 2 family camps where women and children were included as well, but the majority of them were work camps. And a lot of them were in national parks because the government wanted to keep control of the camps. Um, but a lot of the people interned weren't, as you'd expect, German nationalists or Austrian nationalists. A lot of them were Eastern Europeans, specifically Ukrainians, and there was Bulgarians, Serbs, Croats, a lot of the Eastern Europeans, but the majority of them were ethnic Ukrainians, and the majority of them were civilians. They had no ties to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, other than that being the the body that was sort of in control of their lands at that time. Um, so a lot of people who have studied this feel that it had more to do with discrimination against the Eastern Europeans, and there was definitely an economic component to it as well, because a lot of the Ukrainian settlers had come over to farm in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and throughout Canada. And there was a lot of work at the time when a lot of them came over. But then by 1913, 1914, there was a recession, a worldwide recession. And a lot of the labor jobs that these men were taking had dried up. And so there was this concern that there were all these unemployed men, and that they could cause problems. And also they wanted to ensure that any jobs were available were given to, quote, Canadian men. And and that was actually stated in some of the policies. They wanted to ensure that these Ukrainian or Eastern European men weren't taking jobs that other men could have. So it certainly, from the point of view now, it's definitely considered an unjust incarceration for most of those men. And the camp on Mount Revelstoke was really only active between September and December of 1915. And it was a good ways up Mount Revelstoke. So you can imagine in September of 1950, September of any year on Mount Revelstoke, they were supposed to be building the road to the summit. But of course, they spent most of their time chopping wood and shoveling snow. But at one time, there was actually 200 prisoners there in the internees in the camp and 75 guards. So it was very heavy on the guard side, 75 guards to 200 men. So it wasn't very long lasting. So by December, most of the men had been moved to camps, a lot of them in Yoho and Banff and other places. There was also a big camp at Vernon, where there were actually families interned as well. And then during World War II, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and in January of 1942, the government of Canada had an order to remove all Japanese people, regardless of citizenship, from the lower mainland. They had an exclusion area to get started close around Hope or that area. They had to be that far from the coast. And there were internment camps set up in a lot of areas in the interior of BC, like at Caslow and New Denver and Flocan and Greenwood, and sort of throughout the interior. But they also set up road camps, work camps in a few areas. Specifically, there was camps between Revelstoke and Sicamous for road work. There were also camps for the Hope Princeton Highway and the North Thompson Highway. But in this area, there were several camps. There were camps at Three Valley, Cambie, Solsqua, Griffin Lake. This is a picture of the Griffin Lake Road Camp. And between April of 1942 and July of 1944, there were 1,497 men in those camps, and not just here, but in the other work camps as well, like the North Thompson Highway and the Hope Princeton Highway. And the majority of them were young men who'd been born in Canada, spoke English, went to school in Canada, but they ended up in the camps. And again, it was they were concerned that anybody who might have allegiance to Japan, they didn't want them near the coast. They also wanted to make sure that they were employed or working. But it was basically forced labor. They weren't given a choice in that. We actually I've given talks specifically on the work camps before, and we have quite a few photographs that were collected by men who were in the camps. There was actually a sign that's at the little turnout at the pullout at Rutherford Beach at Three Valley Lake. And it's a big sign that talks about the Revelstoke to Sicamous work camps. And when they unveiled that a few years ago, there was a fellow who came out from Ontario who was in his 90s at the time, and he'd been in one of the work camps, and he had lots of photographs, so we've been able to get copies of some of those. But when we're talking about labor, I wanted to mention the fact that there was forced labor that happened in this area as well. So of course, there was the unions and the railway brotherhoods were really an important part of the workers' lives, especially on the railway. There were quite a few brotherhoods and unions that had lodges here. So from 1900 to 1910, the membership rolls of railway unions grew, and by 1916 formed about 30% of all organized labor in Canada. Another reason for the brotherhoods was for the purpose of group insurance. So if you're a member of a brotherhood, you'd pay into an insurance plan. So if something happened to you, your family would be looked after. Quite often, the Brotherhoods would pay for the funerals of their members who died. This is a Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers badge that came from Cliff Stoodley, and it had the back of the badge was black, so that if you were at the funeral of a member, you'd wear your badge with the black side as a sign of respect to the deceased member of the Brotherhood. And we also have a copy of their magazine. This was international, so there's articles in this particular issue in 1960 about Lyndon B. Johnson, who was a rising politician in the States at that time. It was before he became president. And there's a photograph taken in 1954 of the Brotherhood of Railway Trainmen and the Ladies Auxiliary. Most of the lodges had a Ladies Auxiliary as well. Are you recognizing people there? I see Helen Hammond in the back. Okay. Okay. We'll go through this afterwards and see how many we can name. Yeah, Helen was the one that okay. Yeah, we'll go back to this one after and see how many we can name. So there were strikes off and on over the years. There was one strike in 1900. The CPR was citing economic retrenchment, and they laid off quite a few machinists, fitters, boilermakers, and other allied mechanics. So the unions representing these groups claimed that the company discriminated against union men in the layoffs. They also charged that the company had failed to abide by an agreement of 1899, whereby the company and union leaders were to meet annually in Winnipeg to discuss grievances of the employees. So that turned into a 28-day strike in August of 1900, with 1,000 machinists from Fort William to Vancouver going on strike. And there were 15 machinists and fitters out on strike in Revelstoke. The newspaper, Revelstoke Herald of August 7th, 1900, said, the machinist strike meeting in Winnipeg brought forth resolution that the reduction of the staff was a direct blow by the company against the union under false pretenses of a decrease in business, that the company ignored whatever overtures were made to them regarding better conditions. In the reduction of staff, the company practically aimed at the active members of the union, that preference was given to non-union men, that efficiency and length of service was totally ignored. These resolutions were endorsed by each of the unions, and it was on these grounds that the strike was declared. But that strike ended inconclusively, and most of the strikers were rehired by the company, and the men who'd been laid off. So there was another big strike in Revelstoke in 1901. It was on Monday, June 17th, 1901 at 6 a.m., the members of the Brotherhood of Railway Trackmen employed on the CPR main and branch lines from the Atlantic to the Pacific went on strike, seeking union recognition from the company, a collective agreement over the entire railway system, better hours and higher wages. The trackmen at that time were earning 90 cents per day, and they asked for an increase of 60 cents per day. Now, during the construction of the railway, the average wage for a white worker during construction was $2 a day. So these people were actually getting less than $1. The railway company refused to consider the demands. All the trackmen went out, with over 500 workers from the Mountain Division gathering in Revelstoke. The strike caused division in town, with the company hiring strike breakers, many of them laborers from China, Japan, and Italy, who were greatly resented, and said that many local restaurants and stores refused to serve the scab labor. And the provincial government placed special constables along the line to protect the scabs and the company's property. And of course, that increased the resentment in the community. It was actually a public meeting held in Selkirk Hall on June 28th by the local committee of the Trackmen to discuss the strike. They had some of the local politicians speaking there. J.M. Kelly, who is a former member of provincial parliament, criticized the provincial move in appointing special constables. Mr. Kelly said that he considered that the government had taken a very arbitrary step. The strikers had committed no breach of the law, and the government had no justification for the action in taking the part of the CPR by paying special police out of the pockets of the taxpayers. He said that as long as the trackmen did not commit any overt act against the property of the company, they would have the sympathy and goodwill of every member of the community. And Mayor Brown, W.A. Brown was the mayor, W.M. Brown was the mayor of Revelstoke at the time, and said he received a hearty round of applause. He thought that everyone in Revelstoke was opposed to the course taken by the government in appointing special constables, and that the community was in sympathy with the strikers. He congratulated the strikers on their order kept in town and said that if they kept up along the same lines, there was no question but that they would win. And the meeting ended with a memorandum addressed to Mr. Taylor, who was a member of provincial parliament for Revelstoke at the time. Said, we, the undersigned constituents of your riding, desire information from you through the medium of the press why special provincial constables have been sworn in to be employed in the capacity of CPR watchmen. What grounds were advanced for the authorization of enlisting the services of special provincial constables, and have you personally protested that move? And as the strike dragged on, the citizens of Revelstoke were holding entertainments and fundraising events to raise money to aid the strikers. So the community was really on their side in that one. The strike finally ended on August 26, 1901, after 11 weeks. The editorial in the newspaper said, they have proved that their occupation in future must be distinctly classed as skilled labor. They gained recognition and wage increases. In 1902, a well-known American socialist and labor leader came to Revelstoke. Eugene Victor Debs was invited by the local Socialist League. And yes, we did have a local Socialist League in Revelstoke at that time. He spoke in the Opera House on June 25th. Debs was one of the founders of the Industrial Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies. He ran for US president 5 times as a candidate for the Socialist Party of America, obviously never got in as president. At one point, he was jailed for his union activity and for his opposition later to the World War I. But he spoke to the enthusiastic crowd in Revelstoke. He said, we are told that we are trying to array class against class. We cannot do that as our system has already done it. This movement is worldwide, and over 8 million votes have already been cast in the determination to cast off the shackles of wage slavery and usher in the industrial democracy. And he pointed out that coal miners in Pennsylvania were only being paid 78 cents a day. He said, socialists contend that the mine should be operated by the people themselves instead of by a few capitalists who thrive on the toil of the miners. The people cannot be freed until the working class takes over the reins of government. And he got a huge round of applause for his talk. The whole talk was reprinted in the newspaper. So we're going to skip ahead now to the 1930s when they were building the Big Bend Highway in between Revelstoke and Golden that followed the Big Bend going north of Revelstoke and then to the bend and around to Golden. Before that, there was no highway between Golden and Revelstoke. It took close to 10 years to complete the railway. And part of that was because the Great Depression kind of intervened. So it was hard for both levels of government. It was a joint provincial and federal road project. So it was hard for both levels of government to find money to work, to do the work. So for while they were they were hiring a lot of unemployed men who were coming into Revelstoke, were being hired on to work. Initially, it was just sort of the individual crews were hiring people, but then it got a bit more organized, and the provincial government was paying $2 per day for general labor, plus 80 cents per day to dependent families. The rates were to go up over $5 for foremen and skilled trades. But after a few years, the government of Canada decided to actually set up Dominion work camps because there were so many unemployed men across the country, and they set up camps throughout Canada that were actually run by the Department of National Defense. So under that new employment scheme, the men were to be given free board in bunkhouses in the construction areas, 3 meals a day, work clothes, medical care, and 20 cents a day in pay. So it was considered, to get unemployed men off of the streets, off of the rail cars, traveling across, the sort of hobos across the country, and try to give them some actual work to do. There were quite a few men that were employed, across Canada in these camps. The newspaper in 1933, they sent a reporter up to visit the camp, and he said that in fact, the camp facilities provided by the Department of Militia and Defense, under which branch the road work is now being carried out, are improved over those in vogue under the former administration of relief in that area. That time there were camps at 10 Mile, 12 Mile, and 15 Mile, with about 130 men in total, and then other camps to be opened. The reporter said, an inspection shows that the men are being well cared for, and although they are suffering with the whole country through lack of regular employment at fair wages, nevertheless, they appear to be fairly well satisfied. They've made themselves comfortable through various devices. Hot and cold shower baths have been installed. Ventilation in camps is much better than formerly obtained. Hospital and first aid camps are well equipped with frequent medical inspection. Rigid cleanliness of surroundings is required. All cabins are scrubbed out 3 times weekly and disinfected. Sleeping accommodation has been reduced so that healthier conditions might prevail. And the reporter said it was his good fortune to arrive at mealtime. And he said the food was found to be wholesome and plentiful, lacking only in some of the unnecessary frills of a metropolitan eating place. So the conditions in the cookhouses were splendid and clean. He said no semblance of military discipline is in evidence on the work. On the other hand, freedom of action and individual initiative is encouraged. All men on going into camp are furnished ample bedding supplies, outer and inner garments, gloves, caps, boots, socks, mirror, safety razors, and other minor incidentals. In addition, regular and sufficient tobacco rations are served out. And then they also had a little company store where they could purchase items with their 20 cents a day. They were also asking for donations of books and puzzles and games for the people who were in the camp. So they were collecting donations for that. Another one of the camps, here's a few more pictures of, and I don't know whether these were all government work camps or whether they were just sort of general pictures of labor. The construction of the Big Bend continued until it was opened in 1940, but the government work camps weren't in place for quite that long. I think they fizzled out by 1935, and they were just hiring men as needed after that time. But there was also another camp at Clan William, which is just at the end of Summit Lake. Or the lake's actually also known as Clan William Lake. It's actually Clan William Lake in the government records. But so there was a camp there as well. And in January of 1935, there was an avalanche at that site, and 3 men died when the avalanche came right down onto over the camp. There was a man named George Boyd, who was the foreman, and he was a rancher from Sidmouth area. A man named Jean-Edouard Cyr, and who was an assistant foreman, and a man named Joe Dunville. And after that, that camp was closed. So a lot of the men across Canada were quite upset by the conditions in the camp, by the lack of any kind of reasonable pay, and the way they were. A lot of them, despite that fact, saying they weren't being treated as if they were being organized by the military. The camps were really, they were run by the Department of Defense, so they were really being run sort of in militia style. And so there was a group from Vancouver that formed what they called the On to Ottawa Track. And they were planning on going to Ottawa to protest the camps and asking for change. And so they were traveling on top of trains, as you can see this, across the country. And they passed through Revelstoke in early June. The newspaper said on Wednesday evening, over 800 of the relief camp strikers from Vancouver passed through the city on the seaboard freight. Their destination was, as a long streamer on the side of one of the boxcars indicated, onto Ottawa, where they intend laying their alleged claims for just treatment before Prime Minister Bennett. About 10 extra provincial policemen were in town to handle the large crowd in the event of disturbances arising while the train made its necessary stop here of about an hour. The men were very orderly, except for considerable cheering as they arrived and departed. Most of them patronized the local restaurants. Several hundred citizens were at the railway crossing on Mackenzie Avenue to witness the arrival of the train, as well as its departure at midnight. The sight of hundreds of men perched atop the boxcars was unusual, to say the least. And there was a letter to the editor in the next edition from the organizers of the track, who said they were sending $5 to cover the theft of 11 water glasses, 24 cups, 4 salt shakers and spoons, which had been stolen from the Canadian Cafe by some of the strikers. And they wanted to make it clear that they didn't condone any kind of thievery or bad behavior on the part of the strikers. Actually, when they got to Golden, they were met by citizens there who put on this huge feast for them and fed them really well there. In July of 1935, they reached Regina, and a protest led to the Regina riot, which was referred to in the Canadian Encyclopedia as Canada's most violent episode of the Depression, in which one policeman was killed, dozens of men were injured, and 130 were arrested. Premier Gardner of Manitoba sent a wire to the Prime Minister accusing the police of precipitating a riot while he had been trying to negotiate a settlement with the trekkers. So he was blaming the police. He told the Prime Minister the men should be fed where they are and sent back to camps and homes as they request, and stated that his government of Manitoba was prepared to undertake this work of disbanding the men. Agreement to that effect was negotiated. Bennett was satisfied that he had smashed what he believed was a communist revolt, and Gardner was glad to rid his province of the strikers. So the On to Ottawa trek ended in Winnipeg. So there continued to be strikes along the rail line. There was a strike in August of 1950, and we have several photographs taken by Earl Dickey of the trains piled up in the yards during that strike. The newspaper headline on August 24th said, "Revelstoke's major industry silent as Canadian rail workers leave their jobs. There is an uncanny silence around Revelstoke, clanging of engine bells, piercing whistles of many types of locomotives, the thud of boxcars in switching operations, The calls of the CPR shop's whistle are all silent. Long lines of tracks are crowded with boxcars, most of them loaded. Said that there were close to 1,000 men off the job, and regulations, previous regulations which prohibited trucking through the national parks were removed for the duration of the strike, allowing freight trucks to go through to use the Big Bend Highway. And they really talked about, the newspaper was talking about the need for a more modern highway between Kamloops and Field, which really became evident during the railway strike. The strike was in effect for 10 days, or 9 or 10 days, before it was finally resolved. I'll just show some of the photographs that were taken by Earl Dickey. You can see the pile up of train cars there. That's a good one because it still shows the shops and the smokestack. So this is August 1950. So finally, on the strike was resolved. The workers were to receive 4 cents an hour increase. They'd asked for 7 cents. And train traffic said was soon back to normal after the end of the strike. But they definitely, there was notices in the newspaper, an editorial from the Vancouver Daily Province, which was reprinted in the Review, saying, in these days of aerial bombing, no nation can ever be sure that its railways will be safe in case of war. It is therefore imperative that there be alternative transport routes. Canada's 2 transcontinentals are vulnerable, and we should by all means have a highway that can be used if for any reason the railway service is interrupted. The value of such a highway to certain sections of the country was amply demonstrated during the recent strike. Of course, we didn't get the highway till 1962. Just have a couple more photographs here. I don't know exactly when this strike happened, but the workers who were running the ferry at 12 Mile were on strike. We have a couple of photographs from a collection from the Rockert family, the strikers. This person is identified as Eric Kramer. That's the 12 Mile ferry, which is 12 miles south of Revelstoke. It's part of the road from here to Arrowhead. And a photograph of strikers at the government liquor store in the winter of 1959. And this is when the liquor store was in that building between the corner and where the liquor store is now. I think that building opened in early 1950s, but 1951 or so. The previous liquor store, when government liquor stores opened in 1920 after Prohibition, or 22, I think, after Prohibition was lifted, the first liquor store was the building on the corner. When they built this one, I saw when they talked about opening the new liquor store, it said that people will no longer have to stumble down the stairs at the liquor store or up or down the stairs. So that was the liquor store in the 1950s. And I wasn't able to find any information on that strike or how long it lasted. And of course, there's been strikes since then. There was a 5.5-month QP strike from July to December of 1986. It involved more than 1,000 public employees in the Okanagan. They finally had a settlement in early December. It was ratified by the QP employees and 13 municipalities in the Okanagan Mainline Municipal Labor Relations Association. The main issue was job security, because a lot of the municipalities were contracting out work that had previously been done by city workers. So that was, they finally came to an agreement on that. And their settlement, there was no wage increase the first year, but a 2.5 increase for the following 2 years after that strike. A couple of other men. So to close, I just wanted to mention the workers' memorial that was erected several years ago at the end of Centennial Park, just as a memorial for all of the the workers from this area that have died in various workplaces over as long as Revelstoke has been around. Of course, there's been certainly a lot of railway deaths, including the 1910 Rogers Pass slide where 58 men were killed, and a lot of other accidents. Remember Ruby Nobbs, who was my previous boss here, was born in Revelstoke in 1907. Her father was a railway engineer, and she used to say you never knew when they went out for their shift whether they'd come home again. There was that treacherous work, and of course a lot of other jobs were very treacherous as well. She had a woman in last week who was looking for information on her uncle who had died in 1959 in an incident north of Revelstoke. They were with one of the mining companies and were trying to move a piece of equipment across the river on a cable. The cable broke and two men went into the water, and the one man helped the other get out, and then he drowned himself. So there's no end of tragedies and stories of workplace accidents. But so we'll on International Workers' Day we can spare a moment to think about them as well. So thank you for coming today. We've got a couple of things coming up. The Heritage Garden volunteers are doing a plant sale on May 11th. If you have any plants that you're getting rid of, they'd be happy to take them for that. And if you're looking for plants, come on the 11th to see what they've got. And next Brown Bag History on May 15th is on a shooting at Galena Bay in 1894. So 130 years ago, an Indigenous Sinaiaks man was killed by a settler. So we'll be talking about that next time. So thank you for coming. And